This is All India Radio. To mark the birth anniversary today of Satyajit Ray, one of the greatest filmmakers of all time, we bring you one of his rare creations, a radio feature written, produced and presented by Satyajit Ray himself for All India Radio. Titled A Radio Biography of Tagore, this feature was first broadcast in May 1961 during the Tagore centenary.
आनंद ध्वनि जागा गगने प्रिया तुझा दिया पुरावे चाहिया बोलो उठो उठो साभने गभीरो निदामगने जागा आनंद ध्वनि जागा.
He was already well known, though not of international fame, and I was overawed by his presence and by his quietness and beauty. He didn't say much. After all, it is half a century ago, but the memory of him sitting there in that dignified Harley Street dining room with the hansom cabs trotting up and down outside us remains with me, and I should like to bequeath it to you. The memory is vivid. The beard only slightly streaked with grey then, I think. The voice always gentle. And I do myself the credit of realizing then and there that I was in the company of a great man.
The feeling of being in the presence of a great man, which the English novelist Ian Forster experienced, was shared by many who met Rabindranath Tagore in his prime.
At first I thought the visitor must be one of the prophets stepped from the Old Testament. His grey hair hung down to his shoulders, his beard was long and fine, and his handsome figure was dressed in flowing robes which reached the floor. But what struck me most, and has remained ever since in my memory, was his face. It had a Christ-like gentleness, nobility, sadness and lovingness.
I suddenly discovered I could not utter a word in the presence of this distant man who had been so close, so familiar to me through his poetry.
But the odd thing was that admiration for Rabindranath did not necessarily mean familiarity with his work, for it was unlikely that the multitude that greeted him and extolled him in his tours abroad was conversant with all that the alien Bengali poet did or stood for. Professor Madariaga would like to draw a parallel with another great man.
Einstein was admired by at least 1 million persons, for every one who could understand what he wrote. Tagore belongs to this rare category of spirits whose radiation flashes far out into the world beyond the direct action of their work.
If Rabindranath had done nothing else in life, his efforts to bridge the gulf between East and West, to place humanity on a broader base, and to obliterate differences created by barriers of culture, these alone would have given him lasting eminence. But there were many more aspects to his personality.
He asked us to get rid of these caste barriers, asked us to bring the Hindu and the Muslim together. He asked us to strive for the unity of the country. The enemies we have to fight are not the enemies from outside. They are those who dwell within us. And therefore it is, he insists again and again, that we have to correct our own hearts and minds. The revolution, the Hridaya Parivartana, has to take place in minds and hearts of our young people. So for him, education was the great instrument by which men's minds and hearts could be remolded to the pattern of what we think is the right idea.
Poet, novelist, essayist, painter and composer, educationist, social reformer, and fighter against political injustice, all this he was. But even this does not reveal the fullness of his personality.
Father could not bear to see anyone suffer. He would himself nurse if any of us fell ill. It is common knowledge how he nursed my mother when she lay in bed before her death for weeks on end, and how he looked after my sister Rani, a victim of tuberculosis, taking her from one health resort to another. When he could not get a conveyance for himself, he walked all the distance from Kathgodam to Almora along the Dandi which carried Rani.
Eldest son Rabindranath also remembers his extraordinary capacity to withstand pain.
When once he was stung by a scorpion, he sat quietly with his legs stretched out before him, trying to think that it was somebody else's leg and not his, not of his essential self.
And he had his foibles too, as Aurobindo Ghosh remembers.
When he arrived in Cambridge in October 1912, he lived almost solely on sanatogen and carried about a bottle of sanatogen always with him.
But more characteristic was a desire for change.
He easily got tired of living in the same room or the same house for long. When he could neither change the house nor the room, he would put up partitions and shift them whenever he grew tired of the arrangement. Shantiniketan bears testimony of this change-loving habit of his. There are more than a dozen cottages there in which he had lived at different times. He was also fond of changing the arrangement of the furniture and decorations to suit his mood at the time. In the early days, he had with infinite care renovated 2 dingy rooms in the ground floor of the Jorasanko house. For decoration, he had purchased a number of reproductions of English artists. With these, he plastered the walls. Later, these were successively replaced by Ravi Varma prints and paintings from Ramayana and Mahabharata by some unknown artist.
The 19th century saw a great resurgence in the social, political and cultural fields in Bengal, and the man who may be said to have been its architect had close ties with the Tagore family. But although Raja Ram Mohan Roy had been a friend of Rabindranath's grandfather, Dwarkanath, it was Dwarkanath's son who really proved to be his true spiritual successor. Rabindranath Tagore carried on Ram Mohan's unfinished task of tracing Hinduism to its monotheistic basis in the Upanishads and ridding it of its constricting bonds of orthodoxy. Rabindranath, born on the 8th of May, 1861, was Rabindranath's 14th child, and this was probably lucky for him, for there was so much that he could learn from the elders. Music and the arts ran in the family, and there was scarcely any branch of learning that at least one of the brothers had not mastered. Robi's first book of verse, Kobi Kahini, came out when he was only 13. At the age of 17, he published imitations of the Vaishnava poets under the pseudonym of Bhanusingho. He was doubtless pleased with the fact that they took in many a critic of the day. But writing love lyrics and setting them to music was not enough to please the elders. He had to have a regular education, like all young men of respectable families. At the age of 18, Robi was sent out to England. Living in Brighton with his sister-in-law, Gyanadanandini, Robi wrote more verse and mocked at Victorian England in a series of articles he sent out to India for publication in Brother Dejendranath's admirable literary journal, Bharati. He also amused his niece and nephew with his musical antics. Indira was only 6 at that time.
After all those years, I still remember how my uncle used to entertain us with his comic style of singing a particular Hindi song.
All this, of course, leads to the fact that he did not complete his course of studies at the London University. For all his facility for verse and music at this stage of his life, Rabindranath's emergence as a real poet, in his own reckoning, was yet to come. The true inspiration came suddenly, without warning. He was living in a house in South Calcutta with brother Jyotirindranath and his wife Kadambari Devi. He was later
The poem I wrote on the first day of my surprise was named The Awakening of the Waterfall.
When father took over the management of the estates at Maharshi's instance, we moved over to Shilaida, a small village on the bank of the Padma in the district of Nadia.
Rabindranath had married Mrinalini Devi in 1884. Maharshi's instructions to look after the family estates had arrived 2 months earlier. Rabindranath went to Shilaida 7 years later.
At Shilaida, we lived an entirely different life, away from all contact with society and completely confined to ourselves.
The rural surroundings, the wide expanse of the great Padma, the contact with simple village folk, all had a remarkably invigorating effect on the poet.
Father's output of writing was perhaps at its maximum during the years spent at Shilaida.
নাচে রে আজিকে ময়ূরের মতো নাচে রে হৃদয় নাচে রে হৃদয় নাচে রে শতবরণের ভাব উচ্ছ্বাস কলাপের মতো করেছে বিকাশ আকুল পরাণ আকাশে চাহিয়াই উল্লাসে কারে যাচে রে হৃদয় আমার নাচে রে আজিকে ময়ূরের মতো নাচে রে.
My father had become greatly concerned about our education. He was determined that we should not go through the grind of the stereotyped school teaching prevalent in our country, his own impression of the schools in Calcutta having left a bitter impression on his mind.
The school of Shantiniketan came up on a plot of land acquired by Rabindranath in 1862. Among the noblest of his ideals, it was not an easy task to bring it into being. Personal belongings, as well as the copyright of his books, had to go. Neither pupils nor teachers were easy to come by. But Rabindranath was not prepared to give up, for he realized that most problems of the country could be solved if the basic one of education could be tackled. In the midst of all these came personal bereavement. His wife Mrinalini Devi and second daughter Renuka died within a year of the opening of the institution. 4 years later, youngest son Shomi passed away. But his eldest son Rathindranath remembers,
vicissitudes of life, pain or afflictions never upset the equanimity of my father's mind. His inward peace was not disturbed by any calamity, however painful. Some superhuman Shakti gave him the power to resist and rise above misfortune of the most painful nature. After mother's death, father devoted himself with renewed zeal to the affairs of the school at Shantiniketan.
The conception of the open-air educational institution at Shantiniketan, apart from being a healthy scheme, had behind it the vision of a poet. This poetic vision was to guide most of his undertakings, whether literary, social, or political. When Lord Curzon suggested the division of Bengal, it was the humanist poet in Rabindranath who was moved to write a series of magnificent patriotic songs. It was also he who suggested the exchange of bands of friendship between Hindus and Muslims.
Vande Mataram! Vande Mataram!
And when the Swadeshi movement took a turn towards violence, it was the poet whose sensibility was hurt and who withdrew from the political field. It was Rabindranath's own translations of some of his lyrics that paved the way to world fame. Gitanjali, which came out in 1912, had an introduction by the poet Yeats. Translation had given the poems a new garb, and yet they had a beauty of their own. Sybil Thorndike was one of many who were deeply moved by the poems.
My songs are like water plants. They do not stay immovable where they were born. They have no roots, only flowers and leaves. With the joy of light they dance in the waves. Having neither home nor wealth, they are like unknown guests. No one knows when they come or go. When the July rains come pouring down from the clouds and submerge the banks, my water plants, turbulent and restless, lose their way in the flood and are carried away in all directions from country to far country.
Professor Basham's reaction as a youth to Tagore's poetry provides a clue to the phenomenal popularity Rabindranath acquired in Europe.
Like many thoughtful adolescents the world over, I was then going through a period of inner crisis, seeking for some kind of psychological security in a world which presented baffling problems to me and which seemed dangerous and unfriendly. At that time, Rabindranath's poetry, read, of course, in the poet's own English translations, was of great help to me. His vision of nature in the light of the spirit, his affirmation of the fundamental goodness of the world, the deep sense of love and brotherhood expressed in his poems, all helped me to come to grips with the problems of my age. And I think the poems had a real effect on the formation of my personality.
Gitanjali brought Rabindranath the Nobel Prize in 1913. In 1915, he was given a knighthood. 4 years later, he was forced to renounce it as a result of political upheaval, which revealed to him more clearly than ever the callousness of British rule. If his scathing condemnation of the massacre at Amritsar did not actually alter the course of imperialist policy, it certainly gave a wonderful boost to the ebbing morale of his countrymen.
Two hours before he arrived at the great aula of the Berlin University, it was absolutely packed to suffocation. And Tagore, with his 4 or 5 companions, just could not enter. So I remember the famous Professor Harnack, the great theologian, liberal theologian. He stood up with his hands raised and said, I asked for 5 or 6 volunteers who would walk out with me from the hall so as to make room for Tagore. It was a very noble gesture, and he did walk out with 5 or 6 volunteers, and then Tagore could enter. So packed was the hall.
What happened in Berlin was typical of every meeting Rabindranath addressed in every city in Europe and the Far East that he visited on his tours in the 1920s. The dominant theme of his lectures was the need for intellectual cooperation between nations. To him, It was the only way to world peace. He also spoke of his school, his country, and its heritage. And he said, "I don't want adulation, I want love."
Many have rightly pointed out his premonitory and prophetic feeling in regard to the cyclic wars and retaliative misery that have visited our times and our age. And he did speak out against the spirit of war and violence. He did so in Japan, he did so in India. He toured all over this country and Europe on the eve of the First World War and after it was over. And in between the wars, he was trying to give the message of some forms of international worship and work together, which would dissolve the hardness of our hearts and make for a true fellowship of minds, not an identification of religions, not a kind of false unification of cultures, but a real encounter by creative spirits of different countries and cultures.
One important purpose behind the long and arduous journeys Rabindranath undertook, even in his declining years, was to collect funds for his school, which had now grown into an international university. The Vishwa Bharati had opened its doors to students and scholars from all over the world. Songs, fairs, dramatic performances, festivals celebrating the seasons formed part of the very fabric of life at Shantiniketan. An important aspect of Rabindranath's great experiment consisted in organizing a drive towards improving conditions in the villages. Leonard Elmhirst remembers the occasion in America when Rabindranath first mentioned the idea to him.
First of all, he had a sense of humor. Secondly, he came straight to the point and said, "Mr. Elmhirst, I have a school, rather an academic school, in Bengal, and it's situated in the middle of the countryside. There are bare plains all round, and my father started this center, but around us are a number of Indian villages, and for years I've been interested in the village life of Bengal. But what worries me about these villages is that they seem to be in decay. And I've wanted for a long time someone who would be willing to come and live in one of them. And I have a farm 1.5 miles away from our school."
Elmhirst assumed the task Tagore had asked of him.
And this gave us one of our relations. But at the end of 6 months, Tagore said, "Elmhirst, will you formulate your findings? Because I want you to come with me to Calcutta and talk to the students in the university there about what you have found. Can you sum up what are the three main troubles?" And I said, well, the odd thing is they all begin with M. Monkeys, malaria, and mutual mistrust.
Besides Leonard Elmhirst, 2 other Englishmen gave themselves heart and soul to serving Tagore's cause. They were Charlie Andrews and Willie Pearson. Andrews, who knew Gandhi even before he knew Tagore, had an additional task to perform.
C.F. Andrews was always known as the hyphen because he regarded part of his life work as the job of bringing Tagore and Gandhi together.
The relationship between the two men was a unique one. Indeed, Tagore and Gandhi may be said to have stood for 2 dominant, differing, and yet complementary aspects of India. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru admits to have been influenced by both.
I was very much more closely in contact with Gandhiji, and he affected me tremendously. And yet, if I may say so, with all humility, my mind was a little more in tune with Tagore. And as I grew and as I saw more of Rabindranath, I was attracted to him more and more. Attracted, and at the same time I noticed, as I noticed in the case of Gandhiji too, how these two mighty men were constantly undergoing. They were men full of humanity, full of life, full of song, at least Tagore obviously was, full of the joy of life.
Rabindranath's last days were spent largely in Shantiniketan. His countrymen and the world at large had acclaimed him and paid homage to him. In a lifetime of ceaseless work, he had produced more than 50 volumes of poetry, over a dozen novels, numerous textbooks, essays, short stories and plays, well over 3,000 songs, and over 2,000 paintings. He might well have been content to rest on his laurels, but he wasn't. His acute sensibility and the very dynamism of his personality made him respond to every sight and sound, each event and experience. It left him no choice but to keep on creating to the end of his days. One of the last things he wrote was a message on his 80th birthday. It was an indictment of the civilization that had brought forth imperialist aggression, which was then about to destroy the very ideal that was dearest to his heart, the ideal of human brotherhood.
When my mind was released from the black cavern of oblivion and woke up into an intolerable surprise, it found itself at the crater of a volcanic hellfire that spouted forth a stifling fume of insult to man. It witnessed the long-drawn suicidal agony of the time spirit passing through convulsions of a monstrous deformity worse than death. Give me power, O awful judge, sitting on the throne of eternity. Give me a voice of thunder, that I may hurl imprecation upon this cannibal whose gruesome hunger spares neither women nor children, that my words of reproach may ever rock upon the heart throbs of a history humiliated by itself, till this age, choked and chained, finds the bed of its final rest in its ashes.
On the 7th of August 1941, a few minutes after midday, the voice was stilled. Rabindranath died in the house where he was born. His ashes were brought back to Shantiniketan.
To me, who was present when his ashes were brought back to Shantiniketan, to me his death seemed more than mere physical dissolution. I felt, and together with me all those who had lived within the orbit of this unique personality, that what had passed away was indeed a way of life, a way of thinking and feeling. One might almost say a way of dreaming, the like of which no age like ours could possibly reproduce again. And it is no exaggeration to say that we then were filled with a sense of awe and veneration which have never left us since. For I knew that no one who has ever been near him, whether Hindu or Muslim, Christian or Jew, black or white or yellow, could ever again escape into irony or sarcasm when either his common sense or his imagination failed him.
That was a radio biography of Tagore, written, produced and presented by Satyajit Ray for All India Radio. It was first broadcast in May 1961 during the Tagore centenary. A special presentation to mark the birth anniversary today of one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. This program was brought to you by the Central English Features Unit of All India Radio.